Hey everyone, buckle up because today I'm diving into some bone-chilling tales that happen to pizza delivery drivers during their nighttime shifts. These stories are straight out of a horror movie, but they're all too real. First up, we have Jake. For 2 years, Jake delivered pizzas to the Johnson family on Maple Street. The kids, Tim and Lisa, were always cheerful, and Mrs. Johnson was the heart of the household. But one day, she was gone. Weeks turned into months, and Jake noticed the once cheerful family growing increasingly somber. One night, Mr. Johnson ordered a plain cheese pizza, and the atmosphere was heavy and dark. The kids were scared, and Mr. Johnson seemed off. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Later, he saw a news report about a woman's body found in the woods. The details matched Mrs. Johnson's disappearance. Jake realized he had been delivering pizzas to a house where something awful had happened. The memory of the Johnson family, especially the sad eyes of Tim and Lisa, haunted him. If only he had paid more attention. Next, we've got another unnerving encounter. One stormy night, Jake received an order for a place called Ravenwood. The road was dark and winding, surrounded by thick trees. When he reached the address, 13 Lane End, an eerie silence greeted him. The house was old and creepy, with flickering streetlights casting strange shadows. An old man with a pale, gaunt face opened the door and led Jake inside. The house was cold and musty, filled with dusty books and strange objects. The old man insisted Jake stay while his order was prepared. As Jake waited, he felt a growing unease. The old man's voice was soft and raspy, his eyes holding a strange intensity. Suddenly the old man gestured towards a hallway with strange symbols carved into the wood. He unlocked a hidden door, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. Jake, compelled by an unknown force, followed the old man down the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, and the darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides. Finally, a story from Jake's co-worker, Mike. One night, Mike made a delivery to a deserted street. The address didn't seem to exist, and the few houses on the street were dark and boarded up. When Mike knocked on the door, there was no answer. As he turned to leave, he heard a noise behind him. He spun around to see a group of men approaching from the shadows. Realizing it was a setup, Mike quickly got back into his car and drove away as fast as he could, the men chasing after him. Shaken but unharmed, Mike reported the incident to the police and his boss. The experience left him deeply shaken, and he became much more cautious about deliveries, especially late at night. Other drivers soon reported similar experiences, revealing a group targeting delivery drivers in the area. These stories are a stark reminder that sometimes the job of a pizza delivery driver can be anything but ordinary. If you enjoyed these chilling tales, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more terrifying content. Stay safe out there, and remember, you never know what might be waiting behind that door. Thanks for watching. For 2 years, I delivered pizza to a man named Mr. Johnson and his happy family. They lived in a big old house at the end of Maple Street. Every Friday night, Mr. Johnson would call and order the same thing, a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese and a side of garlic bread. His kids, Tim and Lisa, always greeted me with big smiles when I arrived. Mrs. Johnson would sometimes wave from the kitchen window. One day things changed. Mrs. Johnson wasn't there to wave. I didn't think much of it at first. People get busy and maybe she was out or had something else to do. But the next week, she was still gone. Mr. Johnson looked tired when he came to the door, but he still smiled and tipped me well. Weeks passed and Mrs. Johnson never returned. I noticed the kids seemed quieter. They didn't smile as much, and their eyes looked sad. I wanted to ask about her, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't my place to pry into their lives, so I just kept delivering the pizza, smiling and leaving. Then one Friday night, Mr. Johnson ordered something different. Instead of the usual pepperoni, he asked for a plain cheese pizza. When I got to the house, everything felt different. The air was heavy, and the house seemed darker. Tim and Lisa came to the door, but they weren't their usual cheerful selves. They looked hurried and scared, their eyes darting around nervously. Mr. Johnson appeared behind them, took the pizza, and paid quickly. He didn't say anything, just handed me the money and closed the door. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy, but then I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just having a bad day. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced back at the house and saw a shadow move past the window. It sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off as my imagination. The next week, Mr. Johnson didn't call. It was the first time in 2 years he hadn't ordered on a Friday night. I felt a strange sense of worry. What if something had happened to them? But again, it wasn't my place to intrude. A few days later, I saw a news report. The headline caught my eye: "Woman found dead in local woods." My heart skipped a beat as I read the details. The woman was Mrs. Johnson. She had been missing for months, and her body was found not far from their house. I couldn't believe it. I had been delivering pizza to that house all this time, and she had been dead nearby. A shiver ran through me as I thought about the shadow I had seen in the window. Had it been her? The next Friday, I couldn't help myself. I drove to the Johnson house even though they hadn't ordered. The house was dark and there was police tape around the yard. I got out of the car and stood there staring at the house. A police officer approached me and asked what I was doing. I told him about my regular deliveries and how I hadn't seen Mrs. Johnson in months. He nodded and said they were investigating her death. I asked about Mr. Johnson and the kids. The officer looked grim and said they were taken in for questioning. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the Johnsons. What had happened in that house? Why had Mr. Johnson kept ordering pizza, acting like everything was normal? And what about the kids? Were they scared because they knew what had happened? I never got the answers to those questions. The Johnson house stayed empty, and I never saw the family again. But every time I drive past that old house on Maple Street, I remember the smiles that disappeared, the hurried, scared looks on Tim and Lisa's faces, and the plain cheese pizza that marked the end of something dark and terrible. The memory of Mrs. Johnson's wave from the kitchen window haunts me. I wonder if she had tried to tell me something with her eyes. Maybe there was a plea for help that I missed. Now, every time I deliver a pizza, I pay a little more attention to the people I meet. You never know what might be happening behind closed doors. Before we get into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks, it was a dark and stormy night. My name is Jake, and I work as a pizza delivery guy. That night, I had one last delivery before I could go home. The order came from a place called Ravenwood. I had never heard of it before, but I punched it into my GPS and headed out. As I drove, the rain pounded on my car and the wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The road to Ravenwood was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick, dark trees. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just the weather. After what felt like hours, I finally reached Ravenwood. It was a small, old neighborhood with only a few houses. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I checked the address on the receipt: 13 Ravenwood Lane. The house stood at the end of the street, almost hidden by overgrown trees and bushes. I parked my car and grabbed the pizza. As I walked towards the house, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, just the sound of rain and the occasional roll of thunder. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello, pizza delivery?" I called out, but my voice seemed to disappear into the darkness. I was about to leave when the door creaked open. A tall, thin man stood there. His face was pale and his eyes looked empty. He stared at me for a moment before speaking in a soft, raspy voice. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but it was my job, and I needed the money. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud thud. The inside of the house was dark, lit only by a few candles. The air was cold and smelled musty. The man led me to a small table in the living room. There were old, dusty books and strange objects everywhere. I placed the pizza on the table and turned to leave, but the man blocked my way. "Stay for a moment," he said, his voice sounding more like a command than a request. "I have something to show you." I didn't want to stay, but something in his eyes made. For 2 years, I delivered pizza to a man named Mr. Johnson and his happy family. They lived in a big old house at the end of Maple Street. Every Friday night, Mr. Johnson would call and order the same thing: a large pepperoni pizza with extra cheese and a side of garlic bread. His kids, Tim and Lisa, always greeted me with big smiles when I arrived. Mrs. Johnson would sometimes wave from the kitchen window. One day things changed. Mrs. Johnson wasn't there to wave. I didn't think much of it at first. People get busy and maybe she was out or had something else to do. But the next week, she was still gone. Mr. Johnson looked tired when he came to the door, but he still smiled and tipped me well. Weeks passed and Mrs. Johnson never returned. I noticed the kids seemed quieter. They didn't smile as much, and their eyes looked sad. I wanted to ask about her, but it didn't feel right. It wasn't my place to pry into their lives, so I just kept delivering the pizza, smiling and leaving. Then one Friday night, Mr. Johnson ordered something different. Instead of the usual pepperoni, he asked for a plain cheese pizza. When I got to the house, everything felt different. The air was heavy, and the house seemed darker. Tim and Lisa came to the door, but they weren't their usual cheerful selves. They looked hurried and scared, their eyes darting around nervously. Mr. Johnson appeared behind them, took the pizza, and paid quickly. He didn't say anything, just handed me the money and closed the door. I stood there for a moment, feeling uneasy, but then I shrugged it off. Maybe they were just having a bad day. As I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I glanced back at the house and saw a shadow move past the window. It sent a chill down my spine, but I tried to brush it off as my imagination. The next week, Mr. Johnson didn't call. It was the first time in 2 years he hadn't ordered on a Friday night. I felt a strange sense of worry. What if something had happened to them? But again, it wasn't my place to intrude. A few days later, I saw a news report. The headline caught my eye: "Woman found dead in local woods." My heart skipped a beat as I read the details. The woman was Mrs. Johnson. She had been missing for months, and her body was found not far from their house. I couldn't believe it. I had been delivering pizza to that house all this time, and she had been dead nearby. A shiver ran through me as I thought about the shadow I had seen in the window. Had it been her? The next Friday, I couldn't help myself. I drove to the Johnson house even though they hadn't ordered. The house was dark and there was police tape around the yard. I got out of the car and stood there staring at the house. A police officer approached me and asked what I was doing. I told him about my regular deliveries and how I hadn't seen Mrs. Johnson in months. He nodded and said they were investigating her death. I asked about Mr. Johnson and the kids. The officer looked grim and said they were taken in for questioning. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the Johnsons. What had happened in that house? Why had Mr. Johnson kept ordering pizza, acting like everything was normal? And what about the kids? Were they scared because they knew what had happened? I never got the answers to those questions. The Johnson house stayed empty, and I never saw the family again. But every time I drive past that old house on Maple Street, I remember the smiles that disappeared, the hurried, scared looks on Tim and Lisa's faces, and the plain cheese pizza that marked the end of something dark and terrible. The memory of Mrs. Johnson's wave from the kitchen window haunts me. I wonder if she had tried to tell me something with her eyes. Maybe there was a plea for help that I missed. Now, every time I deliver a pizza, I pay a little more attention to the people I meet. You never know what might be happening behind closed doors. Before we get into the next story, if you're here for the first time, please make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for upcoming scary stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thanks, it was a dark and stormy night. My name is Jake, and I work as a pizza delivery guy. That night, I had one last delivery before I could go home. The order came from a place called Ravenwood. I had never heard of it before, but I punched it into my GPS and headed out. As I drove, the rain pounded on my car and the wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear. The road to Ravenwood was narrow and winding, surrounded by thick, dark trees. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I told myself it was just the weather. After what felt like hours, I finally reached Ravenwood. It was a small, old neighborhood with only a few houses. The streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the ground. I checked the address on the receipt: 13 Ravenwood Lane. The house stood at the end of the street, almost hidden by overgrown trees and bushes. I parked my car and grabbed the pizza. As I walked towards the house, I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no insects, just the sound of rain and the occasional roll of thunder. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. "Hello, pizza delivery?" I called out, but my voice seemed to disappear into the darkness. I was about to leave when the door creaked open. A tall, thin man stood there. His face was pale and his eyes looked empty. He stared at me for a moment before speaking in a soft, raspy voice. "Come in," he said, stepping aside to let me enter. I hesitated. Everything about this felt wrong, but it was my job, and I needed the money. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a loud thud. The inside of the house was dark, lit only by a few candles. The air was cold and smelled musty. The man led me to a small table in the living room. There were old, dusty books and strange objects everywhere. I placed the pizza on the table and turned to leave, but the man blocked my way. "Stay for a moment," he said, his voice sounding more like a command than a request. "I have something to show you." I didn't want to stay, but something in his eyes made flickering fluorescent lights buzzed above. Empty booths, sticky with spilled soda. Just me, stack of pizza boxes, and the smell of pepperoni. Another Friday night at Benny's Bites. Mr. Benny, greasy apron, tired eyes, shoved a crumpled 20 across the counter. "Last delivery, kid, then you're free." I grabbed the 20, checked the address, 22 Acacia Avenue, never heard of it. "This new?" Mr. Benny shrugged. "Just deliver the damn pizza, all right?" Acacia Avenue, beyond the edge of town, past the old cemetery, up a winding mountain road. Unease coiled in my gut. Streetlights died out as I climbed, just my headlights on the twisting asphalt. Trees like gnarled claws reaching out from the darkness. Engine coughed, out of gas. I slammed the steering wheel. "You've got to be kidding me!" Phone buzzed, unknown number. "Hello?" a raspy voice answered. "Pizza's here yet?" Shivers ran down my spine. "Be there soon, just car trouble." No choice. I started walking, pizza boxes feeling heavier with each step. Cold wind moaned through the trees, or was it something else? Up ahead a shape emerged from the darkness. Tall, gaunt figure. It lurched towards me, heart hammered in my chest. Closer now. I saw its face, or what was left of it. Rotting flesh, empty sockets where eyes should be. Zombie! No time to think. I turned and ran. Ran until my lungs burned, legs screamed for mercy. Finally collapsed on the side of the road, gasping for air. Looked back. Nothing. Where had it gone? More shapes shuffled in the distance. Coming my way. I had to get out of here. Now! Spotted a driveway leading to an old mansion. Lights flickered inside. Maybe, just maybe. Section 5, Deliverance or Dinner. Flung open the mansion's front door, stumbled inside, dust and cobwebs everywhere. Smelled like decay and something metallic. "Hello?" My voice echoed in the vast emptiness. No answer. A low growl rumbled from the hallway. Not human. I backed away, heart pounding like a drum solo. The front door creaked open behind me. More growls. I was trapped. Section 6, Trapped. Dashed up the grand staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Growls echoed below, getting closer. Found a room at the end of the hallway. Barricaded the door with a heavy dresser. Crouched in the darkness, holding my breath. Silence. Then a scratching sound at the door. Low moans. They were trying to get in. This wasn't a delivery. This was a death trap. Section 7, Hope on Wheels. Window, my only chance. The room was suffocating, the air thick with the stench of decay. I could hear the faint moans of the undead outside, growing louder with each passing second. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that the window was my only escape. I had to act quickly. I smashed the glass with a chair, ignoring the shards slicing my skin. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the room, a sharp contrast to the eerie silence that had enveloped me moments before. Blood trickled down my arm, but I couldn't afford to stop. The urgency of the situation pushed me forward, squeezed through the opening, dropped onto the soft earth below. The cool night air hit my face, a stark reminder that I was still alive. I took a moment to catch my breath, feeling the soft earth beneath my feet. It was a small comfort in the midst of chaos. Just as I thought I was free, a hand grabbed my ankle. Panic surged through me as I felt the cold, clammy grip tighten around my leg. I looked down, my heart sinking at the sight of the decaying hand that held me captive. Looked back. A rotting face leered up at me, its grip tightening. The zombie's eyes were lifeless, yet filled with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. Its mouth opened in a silent snarl, revealing rows of jagged teeth. I kicked out, connecting with its jaw. The force of the kick sent the zombie reeling back, its grip loosening just enough for me to pull free. My foot throbbed with pain, but I couldn't stop now. It let out a guttural scream. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, a mix of rage and agony that echoed through the night. It was a chilling reminder of the danger that still lurked around me, but there were more behind it. The shadows seemed to come alive as more zombies emerged, their eyes fixed on me. I could feel their collective hunger, a palpable force that drove me to move faster. I had to get out of there. Fast! My legs burned as I sprinted through the darkness, the sound of the undead close behind. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, but the thought of being caught spurred me on. I had to find safety, somewhere to regroup and plan my next move. The night was far from over, and the fight for survival had only just begun. Section 8. Not Alone. The night was thick with an unsettling silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl and your heart race. The mansion stood ominously, its dark silhouette looming against the moonlit sky, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance with the wind. Suddenly, headlights cut through the darkness, piercing the thick fog that had settled over the forest like a suffocating blanket. The beams of light seemed almost out of place, a beacon of hope in an otherwise hopeless night. A beat-up pickup truck roared up the driveway, its engine growling like a beast awakened from a deep slumber. The truck's rusty exterior and dented body told tales of countless battles and narrow escapes. A woman with fiery red hair leaned out the window, her eyes blazing with determination and urgency. Her hair, like a flame in the night, seemed to defy the darkness around her. "Get in, kid! Move it!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the night like a knife. There was no time to hesitate, no time to question. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable. Didn't need to be told twice. My legs moved on their own, driven by pure adrenaline and fear. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing longer and more menacing with each step. Scrambled towards the truck, the zombies closing in. Their grotesque forms emerged from the shadows, their eyes glowing with a hunger that sent chills down my spine. Their growls and snarls filled the air, a horrifying symphony of death. Jumped into the passenger seat, slamming the door shut just as the creatures reached us. The woman floored it, her foot pressing the pedal to the metal. The truck lurched forward, its tires screeching against the gravel. Engine roared, tires spitting gravel as we sped away from the mansion, leaving the horde of undead in our dust. The side view mirror reflected the chaos we left behind, the zombies growing smaller and smaller until they were nothing but distant nightmares. The woman glanced at me, her eyes softening for a moment. "You're safe now," she said, her voice a mix of relief and exhaustion. But deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. The night was far from over, and the road ahead was fraught with danger. But for now, in this fleeting moment, I wasn't alone. Section 9. Where to now? The night was thick with fog, the kind that clung to your skin and made every breath feel heavy. The street was deserted, an eerie silence hanging in the air, broken only by the occasional distant sound that made my heart race. I caught my breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I looked at my savior, the one who had pulled me from the brink of despair. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with a sense of unease. She had a hard edge, eyes that had seen too much. Her gaze was intense, almost piercing, as if she could see right through me. There was a haunted look in her eyes, a story of pain and survival etched into her features. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. She grinned, a flash of teeth in the darkness. "Name's Red," she said, her voice carrying a hint of amusement. "I deliver pizzas, too." The casualness of her statement was jarring, a stark contrast to the gravity of the situation. "But trust me," she continued, her tone growing serious. "Yours is a whole different kind of special delivery." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. What did she mean by that? What kind of delivery was this? Her words hung in the air, lingering like the fog that surrounded us. Where were we going? The question gnawed at me, but I was too afraid to ask. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly, the road ahead shrouded in mystery. What kind of delivery was this? The thought echoed in my mind, a constant reminder of the unknown that lay ahead. I glanced at Red, hoping for some kind of reassurance, but her expression remained unreadable. And what other horrors lurked in the darkness beyond Acacia Avenue? The name of the street sent a chill through me. It was a place shrouded in rumors and fear, a place where the line between reality and nightmare blurred. As we drove deeper into the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were heading towards something far more sinister than I could have ever imagined. So, I've been a pizza delivery guy for a decent amount of time, and I usually get stuck with a crappy shift of 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. I live in a pretty small city out in the boonies, so there's only like one murder per year in our area. Well, last month there were 3 back-to-back murders, and we as drivers keep on that stuff. But hey, we average out pretty good for just driving around the city all night, so it wasn't anything to get too worked up about. Anyway, it was probably around 1 a.m. and there was only me, another driver, a cook, and our manager who's in his mid-20s. He's really cool and understanding because he had been a driver in his teens. We were all finished with all the cleaning and stuff like that because it was an unusually slow night that night. Then we finally got an order. I was the so-called lucky one to get to take this delivery down the dirt road in the middle of nowhere. I personally had never delivered to that area, but it was about 10 miles away from where I lived. So I knew there were only going to be about 5 houses on that lonely 4 miles of road. I put the pizzas in my car and started on my drive. I had just put in 2 12-inch subwoofers in the back of my '99 Honda Accord to complete my white trash look, but they weren't secured in there. And being an unkept dirt road, I was driving pretty slow. My GPS told me I had arrived, but it was about a mile off. So I turned down the subs and pulled up to what I believed to be the house. Our boss has a thing about never pulling up in the driveway, no matter how much of a walk it is. And this was one of those times that I thought I'd actually do what he says. I grabbed the pizza and receipt and walked up to the door. It was a long driveway, and what sucked was they had the audacity to leave all the outside and inside lights off to the house. Probably just watching a movie, I thought to myself, as it wasn't this unusual this time of night. I got up to the door and knocked. Nothing. Great, a 10-mile drive here for nothing. I knocked again and again. I started to get uncomfortable. And that's when I heard the quiet sound of someone or something walking. It was coming from around the side of the house that I couldn't see. I was getting a bit unnerved and decided this was a great time to start heading back to my car. I didn't want to go back empty-handed though. When I got to the safety of my car, I decided to ring up the person and see if they were just asleep. I was probably just imagining the footsteps or mistaking them for the creaking of the old house. No answer. I decided to balls up and head over to the door one last time for one final knock, so I put my phone on flashlight mode and walked up to the door. One more knock and I heard the footsteps again, and I turned my light and saw a man wearing some sort of werewolf mask. I bolted to my car with him closely on my heels, but it was obvious that he wasn't the fastest man out there. I easily made it to the car with time to spare. I threw the pizza in the car and floored it, almost hitting the man with my car. I called the police, and it turned out that while yes, this call had been made from inside their house, the actual residents were out of town. This was only a few days ago and they haven't found the guy. I included a picture of the house for all to see. I was parked by the red and the yellow indicates where the guy was. I still wonder if this man was part of the murders in our quiet little town. But whoever that was, they probably weren't in it for the pizza. On a lazy Friday night when I had the house to myself, I was chilling in the living room with the lights off, watching movie after movie. It was past like 10 and I had a craving for pizza, so I ordered a pie from the local late-night pizza place. It was a rainy night, part of the reason why I chose to just stay in and watch movies. Ironically, I was watching some scary movie at the moment. And at some point during that, I heard loud steps coming up the front stoop outside. I waited for a knock or the doorbell, but when I didn't hear either, I muted the TV out of curiosity. I then went to the front door and quietly lifted the slider above the peephole to look out at who could be on the porch. I was expecting to see the pizza guy, but at first, all I thought I saw was black. It took me a few moments to realize that I was looking back at someone's eye pressed up on the other side of the peephole. I basically leaped back from being startled. I called through the door, asking if it was the pizza guy. A deep man's voice called back, "Yes, it is!" But something wasn't right. I looked through the peephole again, and now it seemed like the man on the other side was covering it with his hand or something. I didn't know what to do other than yell, "Why are you covering the peephole?" He didn't respond to that. Instead, he just knocked on the door. I yelled at him to please leave and walked away from the door back to the living room. A few moments later, the doorbell rang. I heard the same deep voice yell, "Pizza! Open up!" I once again got up and went to check through the peephole, but he was still covering it. I shouted at him again to please leave or I'd be calling the police. Now I turned off the TV to allow for total darkness in the house. All I could hear for a while was the sound of the pouring rain outside. When I went back to the front door to look through the peephole once again, now I was able to see through it. The man was no longer on the stoop. I called the pizza place and asked the guy who picked up the phone if he could check if the delivery driver had arrived at my house yet. I, of course, explained what was going on and why I was asking for that. He said he'd give the driver a call and then call me back, so I hung up and waited like 2 minutes. The guy called me back to tell me that the driver had not yet arrived at my house, and he suggested that I call the police. He also said the driver would call me when he arrives. I thanked him and hung up the phone. Next thing I remember, I was hearing knocks from the backyard door. I felt like this couldn't be happening. I actually felt sick. I crept to the back door, which has a pull-down blind covering the glass for privacy. The blind was currently pulled down. This next part I still don't understand. Even though I crept quietly to the back door, as soon as I got there, that same familiar voice said, "I see you there. Open the door." Then he tried opening it himself, but thank God it was locked. Once again I yelled, "I'm calling the cops if you don't leave." By a stroke of good timing, my phone began to ring. It was the real pizza guy calling to say he was here. I told him to please come to the front door quickly. I opened the front door for him and let him in. He asked if I needed help, and I begged him to stay with me until the police would show up. And he did me that favor. The police showed up within 10 minutes. Having someone there waiting with me made me feel a lot better. There weren't any other disturbances from that man outside from the time the pizza guy got there to the time the police left. I went straight to sleep after that. I even went so far as to push my dresser in front of my door just as a desperate act of feeling safe. Thank God that man left for good. It was a little past 9 p.m. on a Saturday 3 years ago. Back when I was delivering pizzas for this pizza place called Gino's. It was my last delivery of the night, my last delivery at that place ever actually. Not because my shift was ending, but for reasons you're about to find out. I was supposed to deliver one regular pizza to this house around 10 minutes from the restaurant. I got there relatively quickly because I drive fast. It was a gated property, so I had to park on the street and walk through the gate up the decently long pathway to the front door. There I rang the bell and waited. No one answered after a minute, so I rang it again. I knew the doorbell was working because I heard the ringing from outside. Finally, the lights in a room next to the front door turned on. So I naturally looked up to the window and there were 2 people looking out the window at me. It was extremely off-putting and unnerving. As I looked back at them, the front door opened. A man wearing some pig mask opened the door. I couldn't see his face, but he sounded very joyous for the arrival of the pizza. He apologized for their costumes and said they were having a role-playing party. He told me to come in for a second since it was cold and that he'd go fetch his wallet. So I stepped into the house and he shut the door behind me. Then he disappeared into another room. I stepped forward a few feet to get a view into the adjacent room, and the 2 people I saw standing at the window moments before were gone. The man called me into another lit-up room nearby. I didn't feel too comfortable, to be completely honest. The whole mask thing was insanely weird, and the 2 creepy people watching me at the window. Still holding the pizza box, I walked to the other room. As I passed the living room into the room next to it, I was just speechless as to what I saw. There were 6 chairs covered in white sheets arranged in a circle. 4 of them were being sat on by other people wearing bizarre plastic animal masks.
Come in, it'll just be a moment.
I asked, "What are you guys role-playing exactly?" All 5 of them erupted into this creepy laughter, making me even more uncomfortable.
Sit in one of the empty chairs.
I looked at him without saying a word. Then I saw someone else, creepily entering the room, kind of half hiding behind a wall opposite me. He was wearing a frog mask. I said, "You can just have the pizza," as I started to back away. There was no more laughter, no verbal response. 2 of the people in chairs got up and started moving towards me. So I did the only thing I could think to, and I threw the pizza box as hard as I could at them into the room and ran for the front door. And then I sprinted to my car. And yes, I was chased outside. One of them tried breaking my passenger side window as I hightailed it out of there. I floored it down the street and went back to the pizzeria where I told my boss what happened, that I was basically robbed, if not about to be kidnapped or worse. He didn't even want to call the cops, and with that, I quit that job that night. Against my better judgment, I got another pizza delivery job a few months later. but nothing even remotely close to something this strange ever happened again. The night was still, the kind of stillness that seeps into your bones, making you acutely aware of every sound, or rather, the lack thereof. It was as if the world had taken a collective breath and was holding it, waiting for something to break the silence. Not a breath of wind. The trees stood motionless, their branches like skeletal fingers reaching out into the void. Even the leaves seemed to be frozen in time, suspended in an eerie tableau. Streetlights cast an orange glow, the only movement the shadows they made dance. The light flickered occasionally, adding to the unsettling atmosphere. Each flicker felt like a heartbeat in the otherwise lifeless night. It was the kind of quiet that made your ears ring. The absence of sound was so profound that it created its own noise, a high-pitched hum that seemed to emanate from the very air around me, the kind that made you want to look over your shoulder. Every shadow seemed to hide a secret, every corner a potential threat. My heart raced, pounding in my chest like a drumbeat in the silence. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. The leather felt cold and unyielding under my fingers, a stark contrast to the warmth of my skin. I could feel the tension in my muscles, a coiled spring ready to snap. My headlights cut through the darkness as I drove deeper into the neighborhood. The beams of light seemed to carve out a path in the inky blackness, illuminating the way forward but also casting long, eerie shadows that danced at the edges of my vision. Each house was darker than the last, swallowed by overgrown lawns and looming trees. The properties looked abandoned, as if they had been forgotten by time itself. The windows were dark, like empty eyes staring back at me, and the doors seemed to be sealed shut, guarding whatever secrets lay within. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling like an eternity. The ticking of the clock in my car was the only sound, a relentless reminder of the passage of time in this frozen moment. A thick fog began to roll in, enveloping the neighborhood in a ghostly shroud. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around the tires of my car as I drove, adding another layer of surrealism to the already eerie scene. I reached for the radio, hoping to find some music or a voice to break the silence. But all I got was static, a harsh, grating noise that only added to my unease. I quickly turned it off, preferring the oppressive silence over the unsettling static. In the distance I thought I saw a figure, a shadowy silhouette barely visible through the fog. My heart skipped a beat, and I slowed the car, squinting to get a better look. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone, swallowed by the mist. My eyes darted around, searching for any sign of movement. The fear was palpable, a cold knot in my stomach that tightened with each passing moment. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something or someone was out there, hidden in the darkness. I pressed down on the accelerator, eager to leave this eerie neighborhood behind. The taillights of my car disappeared into the fog, the red glow fading into the night as I drove away, leaving the stillness and the shadows behind. The street returned to its eerie stillness, the fog settling in once more. The silence was absolute, the kind that made you question if you had ever really heard anything at all. It was as if the night had swallowed all sound, leaving only the haunting quiet in its wake. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting an ethereal light over the scene. The shadows it created were long and twisted, adding to the surreal atmosphere. It was a night that felt like a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, one that I would not soon forget. I finally reached my destination and turned off the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening, a stark contrast to the hum of the car. I sat there for a moment, letting the stillness wash over me, before stepping out into the night. As I walked away from the car, my footsteps echoed in the quiet night. Each step felt like an intrusion, a disruption of the eerie stillness that had settled over the neighborhood. I glanced back one last time, the car now just a shadow in the fog, before disappearing into the darkness. My name's Ben. I deliver pizzas. Not glamorous, but it pays the bills. Tonight, though, felt different, anxious. I kept thinking about the address, 1313 Cemetery Lane. Who names a street Cemetery Lane? The GPS announced my arrival. I was at the foot of a long, winding driveway. At the top, barely visible, sat a house that could only be described as menacing. The house was all sharp angles and dark stone. Gargoyles leered from the roof. No lights except for a faint glow in an upstairs window. It was like something out of a horror movie. I checked the address again. This was it. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed the pizza, got out of my car and started up the driveway. The gravel crunched under my feet, the sound deafening in the silence. As I got closer, I noticed the door was slightly ajar. Strange. I rang the bell. No answer. I took another step, peering into the darkness. That's when I saw it. A glimmer, reflecting in the faint light from inside. It was a pair of eyes. Red eyes. Watching me. My heart pounded in my chest. I took a step back, my hand instinctively reaching for the pepper spray on my belt. A figure emerged from the shadows. It was as if the darkness itself had taken form, coalescing into a being that defied the very essence of light. The air around it seemed to grow colder, and an eerie silence enveloped the alley. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the figure that was slowly stepping into the dim light. Tall and gaunt, with skin as pale as moonlight, the figure stood there, almost ethereal in its appearance. Its pallor was so stark that it seemed to glow under the faint light of the moon, casting an otherworldly aura. The gauntness of its frame only added to the sense of dread that was building within me. It was as if I was looking at a specter, a ghostly apparition that had stepped out of a nightmare and into my reality. It moved with an unnatural grace, like a predator stalking its prey. Each step was deliberate, calculated, and silent. There was a fluidity to its movements that was almost mesmerizing, yet deeply unsettling. It was the kind of grace that spoke of centuries of practice, of a creature that had honed its skills to perfection. The way it moved reminded me of a big cat, a panther perhaps, silently closing in on its unsuspecting victim. And those eyes, they burned into me. Glowing with an intense, almost hypnotic light, they seemed to pierce through the darkness and lock onto mine. It was as if they could see into my very soul, reading my fears and feeding off them. The intensity of that gaze was overwhelming, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Those eyes were not human. They were the eyes of a predator, a hunter that had found its prey. He smiled then, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a chilling expression that spoke of malice and hunger. The corners of his mouth curled up in a way that was both sinister and mocking. It was the kind of smile that promised pain and suffering, a smile that sent a wave of terror through me. I knew then that I was in the presence of something truly evil. His teeth weren't teeth at all, but fangs, elongated and sharp. They glinted in the dim light, razor sharp and ready to tear into flesh. These were not the teeth of a human, but the fangs of a predator, designed for one purpose: to feed. The sight of them filled me with a primal fear, a deep-seated terror that I couldn't shake. It was a stark reminder of the danger I was in, and the reality of the creature standing before me. It hit me then, like a punch to the gut: vampire. The word echoed in my mind, bringing with it a flood of fear and disbelief. I had always thought of vampires as myths, stories told to scare children, but here I was, face to face with one. The realization was almost too much to bear. My heart pounded in my chest and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. This was no myth, this was real, and I was in grave danger. I was face to face with a real-life vampire. The reality of the situation crashed down on me like a tidal wave. Every horror story I had ever heard, every nightmare I had ever had, paled in comparison to the terror I felt in that moment. The vampire's presence was overwhelming, a dark force that seemed to suck the very life out of the air around us. I knew I had to do something, anything to escape. But as I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. I was frozen in place, trapped in the gaze of this creature. He extended a hand, his movements slow and deliberate. "You brought the, special delivery?" His voice was like velvet, smooth and dangerous. My throat was so dry I couldn't speak. I just nodded, holding out the pizza like an offering. He took the pizza, his eyes never leaving mine. His gaze dropped for a moment to the pizza box. And then I saw it. A single drop of blood, on the cardboard. His eyes snapped back to mine, and a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. The look in his eyes sent shivers down my spine. He wasn't hungry for pizza. He leaned in close, his breath cold against my ear. The chill sent shivers down my spine, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if the very essence of fear had taken physical form, pressing against me, suffocating me with its icy grip. I could feel his presence, dark and menacing, looming over me like a shadow that I couldn't escape. "Tell anyone about this," he whispered, his voice a low growl, "and you'll be sorry." The words were like venom, seeping into my mind and paralyzing me with dread. Each syllable was a promise of pain, a guarantee of suffering that I couldn't even begin to comprehend. His voice was a weapon, sharp and deadly, cutting through the silence of the night and leaving me trembling in its wake. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The darkness swallowed him whole, leaving nothing but an empty doorway and the lingering echo of his threat. It was as if he had never been there, a phantom that had slipped back into the shadows from which he came. But the fear he left behind was real, a tangible weight that pressed down on my chest and made it hard to breathe. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my heart pounding in my ears. Each beat was a drum, a relentless reminder of the terror that had just unfolded. My body was frozen, locked in place by the sheer force of my fear. I couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stand there and listen to the frantic rhythm of my own heartbeat. The only sound, the distant chirping of crickets. Their song was a stark contrast to the chaos that raged inside me, a reminder that the world outside was still turning, still moving forward even as I stood trapped in my own personal nightmare. The night was calm, serene, a cruel mockery of the storm that had just passed through my life. The pizza box slipped from my grasp, falling to the ground with a thud. It was a small, insignificant sound, but it was enough to break the spell that had held me captive. The reality of the situation came crashing down on me, and I realized that I was alone, truly alone, with nothing but the memory of his threat and the cold night air to keep me company. The pizza lay forgotten at my feet, a casualty of the fear that had gripped me so tightly. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the fear lingered, a dark cloud that refused to dissipate. I knew that this was just the beginning, that the nightmare was far from over, and that the shadows would continue to haunt me no matter how hard I tried to escape. I stumbled back to my car, my legs shaky. Glancing back at the house, I saw the faint glow in the window was gone. The vampire had vanished, but his warning echoed in my mind. "Tell anyone and you'll be sorry." I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white. What had I gotten myself into, and what was I going to do now?